Welcome. Over the past couple of classes, our law group has been looking at the question of how does the Canadian legal system provide protections for the environment. And in particular, we've talked a little bit about the move towards having more environmental law, as well as some of the tools that individuals like you or I can use in order to try to garner environmental protections. Today, we're going to extend that conversation a little bit further, and we're going to look a little bit beyond the individual to considering how government as well can step into the picture and provide a number of different legislative, supports to make sure that environmental balance is being maintained. Just to reference a little bit some of the things we talked about over the last couple of classes, we did see that you and I have an ability on our own to enact change and protect the environment in certain manners. And in particular, we saw that so long as we have standing, we have a right to make certain claims on behalf of our property or things that impact us, that we can use the legal system, and in particular the tort legal system, which is things like lawsuits, in order to take actions against people who are creating harm, particularly in terms of our ability to enjoy our land and our use of the environment that we live in. The challenge, though, for individuals, and we also talked about this, is that an individual can really only go so far if their goal is to provide that kind of, environmental balance. First and foremost, for an individual to get involved, they have to have legal standing. Most of the land that we benefit from using in Canada is not our own. It's often public lakes and rivers and the atmosphere and so on and so forth. And given that we don't actually properly own that, it may be difficult to convince a court to let us make a lawsuit on behalf of the degradation of that sort of public, property. A second issue is the fact that even if we have the right or legal standing to take action, lawsuits are expensive. And oftentimes, the polluters that we're taking on are large corporations or companies that have a lot of money and a lot of lawyers at their disposal. And sometimes they'll fight battles of attrition, wherein they'll simply spend a lot of time in court and hope that they can actually, through that attrition policy, break down the opposition in terms of the individual because they don't have enough money to maintain an equal sort of challenge against that effort. And so a lack of money or resources makes fighting a lawsuit very, very difficult because of the unevenness of the fight. And then the final thing is just the fact that when you're trying to take on big groups, you often want to promote and sort of gain public support for your actions. But one person can only yell so loud. And given that, it's often very difficult for a single person to really gain a lot of support for their cause. All of these factors tend to lead to a necessary conclusion, and that is that it's not really reasonable to expect the average person to fight and protect the environment for society. Who speaks on our behalf? Who has a little bit more of a voice and much more money behind them? Well, government does. And in fact, government in Canada, both federally and provincially, provides a lot of those supports to us. If you're going to be looking at environmental law in Canada today, it's interesting to note that even though it's a fast growing area of the law, and even though it's an area where there's quite a lot of people who are involved on a daily basis, it's not an easy part of the law to navigate through. If you compare it to something like criminal law, which we spent a lot of time looking at over the past couple of months, it's very different. Criminal law tends to all be in a few kind of basic statute books, or at least most of the laws are within the criminal code or a few other pieces of legislation. Whereas to actually navigate through the very, very complex realm of environmental law, it's more challenging because there's actually quite a piecemeal approach. There's both federal and provincial laws that deal with the environment, and that's natural given the Constitution and Section 91 and 92 and the division of powers. But there's also, even federally and provincially, quite a lot of different single acts that deal with the environment. And knowing all of those and how they all work, it involves quite a lot of legal know-how. Okay, in fact, other than for people who are lawyers, it's often difficult to really understand unless you spend a lot of time studying the sort of lay of the land. You don't need to know all the different acts. Okay, and I've listed a few here which you can look over quickly. The key idea, though, is just to understand that there's quite a lot of environmental law, but it's in many, many different pockets or sort of areas within, the published legislative material. Okay, and there's not one act that exists, but there's many, many acts for many different purposes. We're not going to look at all those laws. It would take way too long, and we don't have enough time as a class. And so what we're going to be looking at, I'm going to look at it a little bit today with you in this particular lesson, is four key pieces of legislation that are provided at the provincial level. The first is what we call the Environmental Protection Act, a very old piece of legislation, but also an important one. Second is something called the Environmental Assessment Act. The third is something called the Environmental Bill of Rights, which at one point in time was meant to be fairly empowering, but of course over time has lost some of those sorts of, I guess, uh, some of that optimism. And then finally, we're going to look at a very recent and heavily debated piece of legislation, which is the Ontario Green Energy Act. For each of these, we'll talk a little bit about how they work, what their benefits are, and also why there's always a few limitations in terms of their overall effectiveness that have to be considered. Okay, so with that being said, let's start by talking about the Environmental Protection Act. The Environmental Protection Act is often referred to by its acronym EPA. Okay, and in fact, there's an Ontario version. There's also a Canadian similar version to this kind of act, and the United States has similar kinds of legislation, also not surprisingly called the EPA. The OEPA is one of the earliest forms of environmental law. And it was published in the early 1970s for the first time as a means of regulating the amount of pollution going into the atmosphere, into the waterways, or into the soil of public lands within Canada. You'll recall from a couple of days ago, we talked about how there had been heavy amounts of pollution in the 50s and 60s in lakes and rivers and streams and smog and terrible issues in the atmosphere. The government did realize that they had a problem during those years. And in Ontario, the solution to that, or at least part of the solution, was to pass this OEPA. Essentially, the way the OEPA worked was it created a framework for preventing and controlling pollutants that went into the air. And in particular, it set limits and said that companies that were going to be producing pollution, well, they weren't going to necessarily be limited to producing none. That would be unrealistic. You needed to maintain an economy. They were going to have controls. And on top of those controls or limits, there was also going to be a requirement that the Ministry of the Environment would be able to send people as inspectors into their corporations or into their companies in order to look at their affairs and make sure that they were actually managing those pollutants so that they hit the limits and that they were doing everything they could to control and make sure that there wasn't more risk than there needed to be. The key section is section 14. And essentially what it says is that if there was a discharge or a contaminant or some kind of pollutant going into public atmosphere, public rivers, public soil, then there had to be those kinds of inspections. And typically there would be a lot of rules about just how much could exist within reason. And of course, a little bit of pollution was allowed for because you can't, again, have no industry. But the hope was that you could limit things down to a more, and this is the key word, sustainable level. So you had that sustainable development and a balance, or more of a balance, between the environment and obviously the needs of industry. OEPA was an important piece of legislation, and certainly it helped to clean up the air and clean up the waterways around the province. It did face a number of challenges, though, and over the years it's always faced these difficulties. One of them is the fact that it doesn't really provide all environmental protection that an environment might need. It really only deals with discharge from a company in terms of air or water pollution. And it doesn't really deal with some of the other issues that would be important, such as, for example, shelter or habitat protection for animals, maintaining a good sort of balance between urban or rural land, etc. One of the other things is that it also it only dealt with things after the fact, and in fact, it only provided sort of a limit, but it didn't prevent things that might have been harmful in the first place from getting off the ground. The final and key challenge is that it had to really be run through the government, and if ordinary citizens didn't feel or don't feel like the OEPA is being used actively or aggressively enough, well, there's not really much they can do about it other than lobby the government for a little bit more pressure being put on the province's key polluters. Polluters can defend themselves if they're deemed to be in violation of certain standards. And the legal standard is that as long as they're spending due diligence or providing due diligence to try to do as much as they can to minimize pollution, then within reason, so long as they're not wildly over the limits, typically speaking, they will be able to have some support given to them and they won't be closed down as companies overall. You can see some of the issues that the EPA dealt with were things like smog, huge amounts of that used to exist within the atmosphere. Here you can see this is Hamilton, Ontario, which for years had tons and tons of pollution out of its steel factories. Part of that has actually been reduced through legislation. Part of it has also just been reduced over time because newer technologies have existed. And finally, some is reduced just because we don't actually produce as much physically in those places. Ironically, the death of certain kinds of secondary industry has reduced a lot of the air pollution that was there. But there's no doubt that the OEPA at least played a good role in terms of making sure that not only were there less pollutants going into the air, but some of the worst varieties of those kinds of I guess sources of pollution were being reduced, and that companies were being careful to try to control what was going in as best they can. A second piece of legislation which went with the OEPA and was introduced in the mid 1970s to kind of pair with it was the Environmental Assessment Act. The Environmental Assessment Act is essentially what it sounds like. It was an act that suggested that rather than just controlling how much pollution could occur, if there was ever going to be a project, a new company to go into place, or a new public works like a road or a bridge that was going to be built, that there actually had to be studies done and there had to be an effort shown by the group producing the product, whether it was the government or a private company, that they were trying to minimize the impact as much as possible on those ecosystems to try to again balance the benefits of new economic activity with the drawbacks of whatever harm might be created. Essentially, the way it works is that there's a goal of sustainable development, and anytime you want to build one of those things, you can't just put a shovel into the ground, but rather you actually have to consult with the Ministry of the Environment, and with their support and the support of inspectors, provide a series of different studies, and usually fairly detailed scientific and environmental studies into the potential impact of your, I guess, production. And then if you're shown that you've made as much of an effort, or if you can show that you've made as much of an effort as you can to control the impact, then you'll get a pass. But if you can't, and if the government feels like you're actually creating too much of a harm, then the OEAA actually gives them the right to, I guess, limit your ability to go through with that project. Now, they don't use this for smaller things, okay, and that is one of the small dilemmas. Like if you're just building a small local road, you don't have to go through an environmental assessment. But for big things like, for example, building a pipeline or building a highway or building a major factory, especially something that might be on a waterway, then you're definitely going to have to go through the, I guess, the parameters of this act. And the hope was that with its introduction, there would be a much careful or more careful monitoring of just whether or not the benefits from new industry would be worth the risks or the sort of harm that might be created. Couple of problems or limitations with the Environmental Assessment Act. One of them is the fact that it's very expensive. And certainly industry will often complain about it, and they'll often say that it takes a lot of time and in many cases actually stalls things that can create economic benefits. And certainly you'll often find that governments that tend to focus a little bit more on the economy, or sometimes companies that are much more focused on the economy than perhaps environmental concerns, will often claim that it's actually sort of red tape. It's something that creates a lot of nuisance and may not necessarily always have their interests at heart. One of the other concerns that often comes about is that it's quite expensive. And because of the fact that people who are launching major projects have a lot more money, there is a perspective that perhaps they may be able to sway the environmental assessment through sort of their own lobbying and their ability to control those compared to individuals who may not necessarily have those benefits. Couple of points that I'll make just to give you an example of how this works. This was an area that actually involved a very famous environmental assessment about 10 to 15 years ago. If you don't recognize that, that is the Red River Valley in Hamilton. For years, if you wanted to get into downtown Hamilton from the QEW, particularly coming from Niagara in the east, you actually had to take what was called Centennial Parkway. And it kind of took you a long ways outside Hamilton, and then you would come back into the city. It was a very out of the way. It wasn't ideal for people in that area. A lot of companies and businesses in Hamilton had argued they needed a faster, quicker connection to the main grid. And so they'd argued that, well, the natural place to put a highway would be to go through the valley, because most of Hamilton had been developed. But within the valley, this was a natural ravine, you of course had a lot of uninterrupted land that could easily sustain a highway, at least in terms of the infrastructure. The challenge is that ravines are obviously areas where there's quite a lot of sensitive wildlife in terms of animals and plants. They're kind of an important greenway in a larger growing city that doesn't have a lot of that left. And so there was a lot of opposition in terms of, well, should this be allowed to go through, and what protections could the city of Hamilton offer as it built this highway, and as the provincial government helped them as well to sort of grow the economy. They ultimately did build it, but it took a long time. They had to do a lot of work to sort of provide for, I guess, supports for things that were being impacted and kind of, I guess, different efforts were made to try to sort of provide counterbalancing benefits. So they had to move certain things, so on and so forth. Another example, 427 going into the area of York. Again, if you're going to be extending a highway or building new highway, you can't just go into farmland. You have to really study what's the impact of this. Is it going to really create a lot of negatives? And can you actually provide sort of protections against those, or sort of contingency plans to make sure that your building will be fine? A final example of a potential future one, we have this large kind of aging, crumbling highway in downtown Toronto. Quite a number of people have been suggesting that, well, we should do different things with it. Maybe we should put it underground. Maybe we should actually just deconstruct it. Maybe we should put greenways on top of it and make it a little bit more sort of appealing and give a little bit more environmental benefit back. Any of those projects could not just go through, though. One of the key parts to a project like that would be that you'd have to have an environmental assessment at some point. A third piece of legislation, which was at one time or one point in time designed to be fairly important, but has lost some of its sort of benefits over time, is the Environmental Bill of Rights. This was passed in 1993, and it was passed after lobbying by a number of environmental groups. And essentially, what it did was it gave more power for the individual to be given support if they felt like the environment was being harmed in certain ways. It treated the environmental concerns that people had as human rights concerns, and it said that just like a human right concern, where you could go to a tribunal and get the tribunal to investigate on your behalf, and ultimately, if they felt like your claim had merit, take on the people who are creating harm. Well, similarly, a citizen of Ontario, if they felt like their interests were being harmed in terms of environmental concerns, could go to this particular body, and if they agreed with the issue, they could actually lobby on their behalf without the individual having to put a lot of their own money up like they would in a tort or a lawsuit. The goal had been obviously to give the public a lot of support, and the hope is that by having all things that involve the environment being carefully published and made available to the public, that they would be able to access information that they wouldn't have otherwise, and they'd have the ability to lobby people within the government to provide support if it was necessary. One of the challenges, and here you can see they actually still have this website. In fact, it's one of the last things to exist from the Environmental Bill of Rights. One of the challenges with this, though, was that while it was actually designed to be a fairly empowering piece of legislation, it was passed at a time when we had an NDP government, which was a little bit more concerned with the environment. In the late 1990s, the NDP government was voted out of power after a recession, and they had a new provincial government that was a Tory government. And the Tory government was not so keen on the idea of having the individual have so much ability, like they would in a human rights context, to take on projects that might threaten the environment. And so they removed a lot of the powers that the individual had. In fact, they took a lot of the teeth out of the act. Most of those sort of passages were removed. And in fact, today, if you look at the Bill of Rights, while you still have a right to know what's happening, any project that might impact the environment, all of those details are made publicly available on a website. And if you're really bored, you can go and look at it. Just type it up, Environmental Bill of Rights, and you'll find this registry. Other than the registry, the actual sort of ability to have somebody take on your cause and have them fight for you, a lot of that was removed, and essentially it became a bit of a dead issue. The final piece of legislation I wanted to talk about was a fairly recent one. Oh, and by the way, that's the old NDP government. If you didn't know, the NDP actually used to have a green logo in Ontario. So before they were the Orange Wave, they actually were the Green Party, which is kind of ironic because they were fighting for green legislation. In the years following, of course, they moved towards the more traditional orange that you know today. And that there was their leader, Bob Rae, who, of course, eventually became a Liberal in the federal government. Final piece of legislation I want to quickly talk about is the Green Energy Act. Green Energy Act was first published in 2009. And it was published by the Ontario government because there was a growing concern that we had too much greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. Too many greenhouse gases were raising the temperature of the world and contributing to climate change. And that Ontario had a lot of carbon emissions and that we needed to do our part to reduce that sort of buildup. Basically, the goal was to try to discourage the use of fossil fuels, and through a number of different means that were part of the act, to encourage people to use other alternative sources of energy like wind and solar power. And that was aimed both at the government, but also at the individual level. How did it work? Well, there were a couple of things. The first thing was that the government committed to actually removing coal energy. Okay, and in fact, while it didn't happen right away, eventually the government did eliminate all of its factories that produced energy using coal, and it moved to just sort of modern sources of energy as well as things like nuclear, all of which is cleaner. The second thing is that it also, and this is where it became a little bit more controversial, it also encouraged a number of people to create green energy options, and essentially, if they had the means to do so, to build things like wind farms and solar facilities and sell energy to the government at a certain rate in order to add positive sources to the grid. They called that a feed-in tariff, and essentially, if you were a person who owned land, so if you were a farmer or if you're a person who just happened to have a lot of property and you were producing a lot of solar energy or you were producing things like wind energy, then you could actually put that into the grid system and you would be paid a rate that was actually above the going rate to encourage that sort of production. You would be given a rate in order to try to not only make money for yourself, but also contribute to the province's cause of having more clean energy as part of its overall, package that was available. There were a couple of criticisms of the Green Energy Act, and we won't get into a lot of these, but I'll mention a few. One of the challenges was that coal was eliminated, but it was the cheapest type of energy. And so essentially what that meant is that energy became more expensive because, at least in the short term, when cleaner, more efficient types of energy in terms of their greenhouse effect were being introduced, they were also a lot more expensive. And so you're getting rid of a very cheap source for a higher cost source, and is making things higher in terms of people's electricity bills, just the overall cost. A second concern was the fact that the farmers and people who were selling their energy were actually being given far higher than usual rates as an incentive. But a lot of people started to feel like, well, that was actually just taking money from average citizens because taxpayers were paying and giving it to people who were able to afford these kinds of luxury type of, environmentally friendly sources. And so farmers with wind farms and things like that were actually making quite a lot of money and annoying some of their neighbors in the process, because not everybody, and you'll see this in the next part, not everybody necessarily wanted to have those sorts of things around. Okay, and there's a NIMBY sort of not in my backyard opposition, where a lot of people said that, we find these things noisy, they give us headaches, and we just don't want them to actually be here. Lots of people have criticized the Green Energy Act over time. Certainly the current government is a little bit more skeptical than the government that had been in place before. They haven't gotten rid of it entirely, but there has been pressure to maybe reduce some of the more controversial aspects. And certainly that may happen over the next few years of the government's mandate. We'll see. Okay, this is getting a little long. I didn't want it to be quite so much detail, so I'll end things there. Your homework for tonight is to do a quick summary of the things that you've been reading about or listening to over the last few minutes. If you go into pages 365 to 372 in your textbook, it talks about these issues. What I want you to do is I want you to read that, and then very quickly on page 73, do questions 1 to 3 as a summary. We'll talk about these during your next lesson, and then after we've done so, we'll move on to a new theme, which is going to be international law.